My pleasure. It is my pleasure to introduce Suzanne Grouette, our guest speaker today. Known for her abundance of curly red hair and her exuberant personality, our guest speaker today is a dedicated Rotarian who is the district coordinator for honoring Indigenous peoples for Rotary District 6400. She is also the chair-elect of Rotary Club of Windsor, 1918 Satellite Club. And if that's not enough, she is also the incoming Assistant Governor for Area 10 for 2022 through 2025. Our guest speaker is Metis and has found it important to advocate for changing the narrative regarding First Nations, Metis, and Inuit people. She serves as a member of the Indigenous Heritage Committee at her workplace, Mercedes-Benz Financial Services. Please welcome our good friend, Suzanne Grouette.
Presentation, please. And actually someone to
Can't see it on the computer.
So while this is coming up, I've had the pleasure of speaking with this club before about Indigenous topics. This one is going to be a little bit more specific about our area in particular. When I say our area, it's important to remember that even though there's a river that runs through it, there wasn't necessarily that international boundary a long time ago. And so when I speak of our area, it's southwestern Ontario and southeastern Michigan as well. Very good. Next slide. I was very, very pleased to hear Irene give the land acknowledgement. I had one prepared just in case, but she did a fine job. And very happy that this club does have a land acknowledgement. That's one of the very important things for us to do to understand that this area, again, this area is not, we're not the first feet to walk on this land. Slide. And one more. A lot of people ask me why I'm so passionate about this topic, and Irene mentioned that I am Métis. This lovely, beautiful lady here is my grandmother, my mother's mother, and she was a Dawa, of this area. And then next. And these lovely people, I'll get it in the way, are all Métis, including the little redhead there, red curly hair. Yeah. So this is my father's parents here, Auntie. And then one more. And this is me in my regalia that is suitable for powwow and other ceremonies. So we didn't know as a family about our heritage. It's pretty obvious that this lady had some kind of background, right? But she wouldn't talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it. She was ashamed. And these folks came from a reserve in Manitoba, but also didn't want to talk about it. It was not something that was ever brought up in our family. And so it wasn't until they were gone that we started looking into our heritage and started realizing what an abundance of culture and history we have with this land, and really started digging into it. And so that's why it's one of my passions.
Suzanne,
Yes.
can you give us the correct definition of Métis?
That's a really good question because it depends
Is
on
it part,
who
if
you.
it's part of your presentation?
No, it depends on who you ask. So Métis, for me, is the strictest definition because I come from the Red River area. My family comes from the Red River area, and it was traditionally Cree and French Canadian. Now it also has a meaning of half-breed, if you will, but part Indian, part native, part.
But is it always French, part native, part French?
In Manitoba, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So what does First Nations and Rotary have to do with each other? Well, our friend Paul Harris says one's nativity is not his own choosing, but whatever it may be, it is entitled to respect. And all nations have honorable place in the world's family. And then Senator Murray Sinclair, the Right Honorable Murray Sinclair, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said, ultimately, reconciliation is about commitment to establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship. So we have a lot in common in terms of respecting other people. One of the things, there's an awful lot on this eye chart, but one of the things that I want to mention is that for thousands of years, there were people in this area actually called Turtle Island or North America. And so people started coming over, they think, from other parts of the world over the Bering Straits 40,000 to 70,000 years ago, and then 25,000 years ago. So by the time Canadians, or Europeans, I should say, got here, there were millions of Indigenous people who were living coast to coast to coast with a variety of social, economic, political, spiritual, and cultural systems that were already in place. So there are 5 traditional groupings associated with the Indigenous people who were on Turtle Island. Much of it has to do with geographic characteristics, but also cultural similarities and linguistic similarities. So the ones that we are focused on in this area are Haudenosaunee, which are mainly the Mohawk and the Huron. So Huron were in this area, Mohawk a little bit up north of this area and east. And then the Woodland First Nations, Woodland and Swampy Cree, Anishinaabe, Toji Cree. So these are folks that tended to live in this particular area and in Michigan. So what we might have thought of in the past of teepees might not have been what we saw necessarily in this area. We have along the top line are the Haudenosaunee or the Mohawk. So folks playing, kids playing lacrosse. Lacrosse, of course, was our first national sport. And the Haudenosaunee were farmers and lived traditionally in longhouses. So family units within longhouses. And there's some art, some jewelry that came from Haudenosaunee. Anishinaabe had something a little bit more like the traditional teepee that you might have seen in Hollywood, but also had longhouses. And here's some of the beadwork and leather work for the Anishinaabe. So there were, at the time of, I guess, the 1600s, people started coming in from Europe and colonization started. And one of the things that they did was outlaw the Indigenous culture because it was different. And all the spiritual practices. Instead, we saw a lot of imposing of the European ideals. Between 1871 and 1921, there were numbered treaties, and we're going to talk a little bit about the numbered treaties here. But basically, the idea of a treaty was monetary payment of some sort for the use of land. And so you'll hear a lot in terms of that is treaty territory, which means you can use that land, but we're supposed to get something in return for it. So in Essex County, we have Treaty 2. It's called the McKee Purchase, and it includes the area of Point Healy. This happened in 1790, and a little more information on this. The McKee Treaty was the southernmost treaty in Canada, and the payment was approximately $2,000, and then clothing or cloth, I guess, to make clothing, some tools, some eyeglasses, combs, ribbons, and hats. So that's what was given to the folks who lived in this area in order for the Europeans to use the territory. And this, it also included a part of Detroit, which was later, of course, when the Revolution, the American Revolution happened, and then the War of 1812, that kind of ceded the territory, the Treaty 2 territory, I should say. Walpole, also Windsor-St, Amherstburg was Treaty 35 with the Huron-Wendat people. Huron-Wendat people were kind of gathered up and moved into an area into Quebec. And so as a part of that, the Treaty 35 gave them a certain amount of money, cloth again, to move them from that territory in order for us to populate the territory. Yes.
Suzanne, is Wendat our anglicized Wyandotte?
It is indeed. Yep.
Thank you.
And then Walpole is unceded. So it's unceded territory, meaning it's never been officially given over to the government. So that's just another piece of trivia for this area. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008. Their job mainly was to listen to the stories of people who lived in residential schools or who survived, I guess, the residential schools. One of the things we found well after my grandmother passed away was her mother was the survivor of residential school. And she lived a long, a short life with a lot of, I guess, the results of trauma coming from that. And one of the reasons why my grandmother was embarrassed embarrassed to be Indigenous was in order to fight those demons, she ended up drinking and ended up drinking herself to death, which is not uncommon. When people are taken away from their parents, taken away from their homes, taken away from their traditions, and put in an institution and not given a lot of love, support, training to be a parent and parenting skills. So that was the kind of story that they expected to hear as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What ended up happening was 6,500 witnesses ended up coming forward and giving their stories. So it took 3 years as opposed to 3 months. They didn't think it was going to take that long. It took a lot longer than what was expected. And what came out of that was recommendations for 94 calls to action. Of the 94 calls to action that happened in 2015, we now have 10 that are closed or that have been addressed. So the first 5 had to do with child welfare. Again, the idea of ripping a child away from their family is something unheard of today. We wouldn't want to see that happen. And yet it was something that was, even up until the 1990s, that was done. 6 to 12 had to do with education, and education also in terms of people's languages, because people were not allowed to speak their language. Some of the languages almost died. And so a lot of the education is focused on language. 13 to 17 were culture, 18 to 24 had to do with health, 25 to 42 had to do with justice, and then 43 to 44 have to do with, I don't know if you've heard of UNDRIP, but it's the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous people, that all Indigenous people have a right to their territory, to their culture, to their language, and so forth. And then 45 to 94 were what kinds of things we can do to work toward reconciliation. So addressing our legal system, training for government officials, churches, educators, and then remembering those who were impacted by the residential schools. One of the things that Marie Sinclair said as a result of the commission was, I've lived in both worlds. He's a judge and very well respected in both communities. So in the white Canadian community as well as the First Nations community. He says, I've lived in both worlds, and I know that as much as we're taught that we're dirty Indians, you're taught the same thing. And so it's something that we need to address on all sides of education, that there is a rich, beautiful culture, and that there's a large society behind what we see on the screens that Hollywood may have portrayed to us. So one of the groups that is working to do this, and this is what I'm representing today, is Honoring Indigenous People. Honoring Indigenous People, HIP, is a group that is half Rotarian and half Indigenous. The board of directors is half male, half female. And the idea is to empower Indigenous people through improving education and promoting understanding. So one of the calls to action, excuse me, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And a couple of the things that are happening within HIP, one is actually not in HIP, but it's being supported by HIP, and there is a meeting that is going to take place in August, and it's the first meeting of its kind in the last 200 years, and it's the chiefs of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations coming together to reaffirm one of the oldest treaties in Turtle Island, which is between those two nations. And it's called the Great Wampum Treaty. And so it's rather exciting that it's the chiefs of these two nations coming together. So that's something that's being supported by HIP. But another that is very, very much exciting that's happening in the Treaty 5 area in Ontario, Northern Ontario, is something called Youth to Youth. And Youth to Youth brings, again, 50% Canadian youth together with 50% First Nations youth. And they're taught leadership skills, both in terms of, traditional Canadian teaching, but as well elders teaching in the First Nations style. And then also stewardship for the land, which is something that's very important to the First Nations, but also very important to us as Rotarians now with our seventh area of focus being the land and so forth and the environment. So after they go through this training process, then they actually get paid internship, which is where Rotarians come into play. Because a lot of Rotarians have businesses where they can bring these youth in and give them a chance to try out some of their skills in the workplace. So a lot of exciting things happening with it. You can become an ally by going to the website. You can check it out, honoringindigenouspeople.com, and supporting some of the activities. It's something, if we get a groundswell of support, we can do more in this area. Another thing that I was going to mention also is the water circle. So the water circle is taking all of the expertise that Rotarians have with water projects that have happened all over the globe, and putting them together with First Nations leaders who understand the water situation in their communities. And right now there are 3 pilot projects that are happening to help with wells in some of the First Nations communities. One is in BC, one is in Saskatchewan, and one in Ontario. So what can you do to become an ally? Encourage articles and newsletters and electronic media with regard to Indigenous topics. I know Irene is very good about sharing some of that information on Facebook. Make resources available at meetings and conferences. The fact that you are giving your land acknowledgement is tremendous, and it's a great first step. Inviting young people who have followed some of their post-secondary training and education to come and talk about their experiences, and then just creating opportunities like this to discuss the issues. I'm not sure what time it is.
It's 8 o'clock.
Okay, all right. And we talked about the land acknowledgement. I don't need to go into that any further. I can share this with John. So here are some things that you can do to familiarize yourself. There are terminology, some of the things you say, oh, I don't know why that, I used to say that all the time, too many chiefs, not enough Indians. Why is that derogatory? So some of the things that are considered offensive. The calls to action. I love this site that I noted here because it's actually directed toward kids, but I found it very helpful myself in understanding the calls to action. Have you ever been on Ottawa Street, Native Wonders? There's an awesome, awesome First Nations restaurant and store on Ottawa Street. It's called Native Wonders. So feel free to stop by and support them also. And then Good Minds is a publisher that publishes First Nations authors. And Grouette, thank you.
Add one more resource on your resource list?
Absolutely.
So, and this came about through the environmental stuff that I'm doing,
Yeah.
and native plants and indigenous plants, etc. And it was a book that was recommended just numerous times as I was going through readings and such. And it's Braiding Sweetgrass.
Oh yes.
And so it's a beautifully written book. I think she's probably a poet in her other life, but she's a botanist and an indigenous educator out of one of the universities in the US. And so she writes chapters on various sort of plant-related but not plant-related. And it's basically stories about how the Indigenous have honored the earth and the relationship with the earth. And some of the stuff she writes is beautiful, and it really gives you insight into the culture of the older culture and the elders and the respect for the land. And it's a really very well read, easy to read. They go by chapters, so you can read one chapter at a time, different stories. But I highly recommend it if you want to kind of get a little bit of insight into that really beautiful relationship with the earth that the Indigenous have. So
Spoil the ending, I'm halfway through.
oh yeah, no, I won't tell that.
Just to let you know, we have the Wyandotte Anderton tribe in the downriver area that's very active. Chief Ted Roll is very active with us in our trail town planning and trying to get trails built along the river. And also when they opened the John Dingle Wildlife Refuge Center, the Anderton tribe was invited in to come and bless the land.
When you were, well, there are a couple questions, probably. One of them you said only 5 things out of 94 have been dealt with,
10 things.
or 10 things out of 94. So out of those different groupings, only the top ones have been dealt with? Or
No,
just
it's-
a couple of different ones?
Yeah, a couple of
Okay.
different ones. Yeah.
How much involvement is, like you said about internships and stuff like that? How much of that is also government related? Like, is there internships, to open up a few things, whether in municipal government, provincial government, federal government, to the youth that are learning these things? Do you know if there's something
There
that involved as opposed to just corporate?
There are grants that are available, but our government tend to leave it up to corporate and,
So they're not
and
opening the
groups
doors
like,
that easily. So there's got to be a push for that a little bit too. Because nothing's gonna change unless leadership changes a little bit too, right?
Right.
I think.
Then one of our clients is a group of shopping centers, a management company that manages 20 shopping centers across Canada, all the major markets and some minor markets. Our role is to bring them campaign ideas that help connect with the community about current issues and things of that sort. We developed like a diversity campaign a couple of years ago that was very successful. If we were to focus on the issue with Indigenous people, what would the goal of that campaign be? Would it be awareness in the communities? Is there something else that you can suggest?
there's awareness and relationship building. So one of the things that is very big with HIP is making sure that you have a relationship established before you go in and try to fix a problem, which is not unlike Rotary going anywhere in the world, right? We want to make sure that we understand what's going on first. So for example, there was a group in British Columbia and a Rotary Club, and they wanted to, deal with this water issue. But when they started getting to know the people in the reserves that they were talking to, they said, you know what, before any of that, we need education. We need access to libraries. We need access to the internet. We need education. That's our number one thing. So thank you, but can we start with books? So it's important to know and to build the relationships, and then find out what it is that we can do to help and support and walk together toward a solution.
Because it would be interesting, across Canada, you would have very different, like in Halifax, one of the malls is called Micmac Mall. So I mean, it's already somewhat connected to
Yeah,
that. And then on the West Coast, it would be very different. The goal would be very similar in all of it.
yes, awareness awareness, understanding,
And relationship
respect,
building.
and relationship building.
And I'd love to get a copy of your presentation.
I'll send it to John. Anything else? Yes,
I have one more. Okay, so I was at finally I went to an Ontario Physiotherapy Association annual gathering because it was virtual and I didn't have to travel to Toronto, which is kind of nice. And anyways, it's on diversity that day, and we had some amazing speakers talking about the diversity in our workplace as physiotherapists. And we had a gal get up a PhD physio that was working at one of the schools, and she talked about the Indigenous. And she was talking, an analogy that she said that stuck in my mind is that she said that before we used to think that we were all swimming in the water, and there was an Indigenous and there was the settlers all swimming in the water, and that was, there was more of us basically now. And she said, we're not swimming in the water with the Indigenous, we are the water. We are our attitudes and everything. So it just really struck me as that our culture is so big and encompassing, and it's really hard to recognize that it's our huge attitude that we have to look at. All the things that I learned on that, other than how to do this long haul code, but whatever.
Yeah.
That was one thing that really struck my mind. I don't know how that resonates with you, but that really made me feel like how much we are, how much work we have to do.
Yeah.
Structure.
Yes, Suzanne, I don't have a question, but I have an observation. We had, when I was a little boy, our family had a cottage in Long Island. My brother and I, we actually made friends with boys that were up there, and not a hell of a lot to do on Walker Island in the summer, but anyway, we did make friends. We did do a few things, and we became very familiar with predominantly the negative stereotypes that are associated with it. As we got older, and the more I learned a little bit, I discovered that there are some very positive stereotypes and some unique qualities. One of the unique qualities of the Indigenous, when I found really interesting was a number of years ago, we had a radio tower up in Midwestern Ontario, and it went 600 feet in the air. And we needed to change the bulbs on the top of the area, those red flashing lights. We had a hell of a time finding engineering firms who had people that were willing to go and climb the towers. They did locate somebody, and he was from the Mohawk tribe, who are famous for being skywalkers and steel workers and working at great heights. And so we got a lot of these people from the Mohawk tribe to help them do that. And since then, I've learned more about their ability to work at courage or something. It's all very positive, their ability to work at these.
It is interesting, yeah.
How do the Mohawk relate to the Iroquois?
They are both Haudenosaunee.
Okay. Because I know that as we're driving up north to our cottage, we go through Mohawk territory, but there's an Iroquois cranberry marsh in that Mohawk territory. So are they
So there's
Are they
probably
like
at some
brothers or
point,
cousins
yeah,
or
cousins.
cousins?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Right.
At some point, there was probably a treaty that brought them together to share land.
But they're different tribes. It's not like the Mohawk or part of the Iroquois.
Saying that, I'm not Mohawk or Iroquois, so.
All right, Carlo, if you do the thinking.
So it is my job to thank you, actually. And I really thank you because it's very enlightening, Suzanne, what you brought up. It was you could hardly hear a pin drop, not only because it's carpet, but just because that's the way it is. everybody was listening intently. We all want to know more. We all are very appreciative of you coming, obviously. And I guess by you sharing and probably put it on Club Runner, the links and things like that, it'll give us more insight. And I do believe that all of us, whether we are employers or I feel the government too, can do more as far as hiring youth, hiring people that have different backgrounds of all kinds, so that we can make the world, full stage that it should be. So thank you, Suzanne, for the
Thank you.
insightfulness that you bring to us today, and hopefully
get a
we
picture?
all bring it more. Oh, yeah, sure. Well, since Chuck isn't here for the picture, I guess I'll sit in.
Yeah. Let's do
You
check
can
that.
you get a photo op.
We have to do the 6-foot thing. You got the wide lens?
That way, move over that way.
This way? Oh, okay. Well, Bob was telling me to move that way. Who's directing this show? Ed, what should we do?
Whatever you want.
Sign up for Barry.
Sign up for-
Thank you.
Great job.